This is the NCCCA conversation with Owen Gaffney. Just a little background on how this came about. I read Breaking Boundaries, which was co-authored by Owen and Johan Rockström, and saw the movie on Netflix, if you haven't seen it, titled Breaking Boundaries with Johan and David Attenborough. I was just so impressed, I had to reach out, and happily Owen was reachable, accessible, and agreed to have a conversation with us. Owen has worked at the Stockholm Resilience Center, started several climate organizations, and is about soon to take on a new job. So Owen, would you like to say more about your background so that our audience can understand where you're coming from?
Absolutely. Hi, Joe, and thanks so much for inviting me to join you to have this conversation. So, actually, I'll be leaving the Stockholm Resilience Center. I'm starting a new position with the Nobel Prizes next week on their most exciting week of the year as well. The week the announcements are made for the prizes, but I'll still be very much doing the work I have been doing for several decades now around global sustainability and Earth system science, and my work is really at the interface between the scientific community and then policy, business, media, and public. I work deeply with the research community on looking at the problems and articulating the problems and framing the problems, but also the solutions, and how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess, and taking a systemic view of the solutions. So, as you say, I'm the author of a few books. I've got a new book just out last week, which is Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. We launched at New York Climate Week, which is super exciting. And as you say, I was associate producer on the Breaking Boundaries documentary. But I also do research as well. I also publish research on systems change and tipping points and these kinds of issues, which we'll come to. So delighted to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Owen. I would like to just begin with an observation from this morning's Bloomberg News here that came across the internet. And in the Bloomberg News article, they said there's a value associated with nature. So this is pretty interesting. They said the amount by which annual borrowing costs, so we're talking about interest now, for 26 nations, including the US, would increase if there is, quote, a partial ecosystems collapse. The article doesn't define exactly what that means, but what shocked me was the cost associated with a partial ecosystems collapse, and interest is only $53 trillion, which is, that's more than half of the global GDP kind of thing. It's an extraordinary number. So what we're talking about today, Breaking Boundaries, the science of the planet, if you will, and Owen's new book, Earth for All, resolving some of the challenges the Breaking Boundaries work has identified, is absolutely fundamental to what we're up to and what's happening on the planet. So Owen, perhaps we could begin by asking you to summarize the Breaking Boundaries research, the boundaries that we have exceeded, the implications of that, and the state of, I'm looking for the word, I want to say runaway conditions. What's the word I'm looking for? We just talked about it.
Yeah, the kind of hothouse Earth scenario.
Yeah, that and the tipping points. Yeah, what are the tipping points that should be most worrying right now, and what's the state of the research on tipping points and boundaries?
Yeah. Okay. So this is yeah. These are big questions, and maybe I'll start with the tipping points work, because that is that's the most recent update I can give you. So there, we just had the UN Climate Week and UN General Assembly last week, but 2 weeks before that, actually on the Thursday that Queen Elizabeth passed away. That day, and in fact, 30 minutes after she passed away, after the announcement came out, we published a paper in Science, one of the world's leading academic journals, on tipping points, the latest update, the latest knowledge on the state of tipping points in key Earth systems. And the findings are extremely alarming. I think in any other day, this would have been one of the biggest stories of the day. And in fact, it's not even a big story for the day. It should be a big story for the decade or the century, because what we concluded is that right now, today, we are at risk of crossing tipping points. There are several major systems. I'm talking about the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. Both hold enough water, if they were to melt, to collapse, to raise sea levels by 10 meters, 30 foot, if you can imagine, over a long period. But not just those systems, but also permafrost in the high Arctic, northern Russia, northern Canada, northern Scandinavia, where I'm sitting, which as that melts and we put more, as that thaws, we put more methane into the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Coral reefs and also Arctic parts of the Arctic sea ice in the Barents Sea. So these 5 tipping points are already on the move now. We're seeing already unprecedented changes in those systems, and if we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we could they're likely to cross tipping points. So that's the key finding in the paper, that they're likely to cross tipping points. And as we go, as we warm up even further, then we can hit. We're more likely to hit more tipping points related to the Atlantic overturning circulation, for example, which brings warmth from the equator up into the northern parts of Europe and into the Arctic, and that's looking like that's already slowing down, and that could reach a tipping point as we go pushed way beyond these temperature thresholds. Also, the Amazon rainforest also could reach a tipping point, potentially around 3 degrees, 4 degrees or so. But we're already seeing major changes already happening in the Amazon rainforest. So across the world, the critical point here is that about back in 2008, a group of researchers led by Tim Lenton at Exeter published a paper on tipping points, and they outlined for the first time a suite of tipping points where that we could hit as temperatures rise. But really, the risks back then were assumed to be way off late this century or into the next century or so, as temperatures keep rising. But the key finding is, as we're finding out more and more about tipping points from climate modeling, from paleo data, looking back through ice cores and tree rings, and through data from satellites and in situ, we're seeing that huge changes are happening at a much earlier stage. So this is extremely alarming, and not least because the Paris Agreement proposes, world leaders have agreed to stay well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5, and it really points out that well below 2 degrees, that aiming for 1.5 goal is an absolute maximum. We're taking huge risks already with that, and we should not push beyond that. But to stay well below 2 degrees, to aim for 1.5 will take an absolutely huge effort this in the next decade to achieve that. So that's, and we'll come on to that later. Your other point on the planetary boundaries. Then maybe
Owen, excuse me just a moment. Could I just ask a little bit more about tipping points or make some
absolutely
comments on that? Yeah, thank you. I was impressed recently reading a book. It's only been out about a month or so, titled "Moving to Higher Ground" by a fellow named John Englander, who seems to be a key researcher and intimately knowledgeable about sea level rise. And at the same time, there was that I was reading the book, there's an article published that said we are now committed to 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise from melting in Greenland, regardless of what we do. We already have, basically a foot of sea level rise locked in just from Greenland. And Englander says, don't be surprised if by the end of this century, we have 3 to 10 feet of sea level rise. That once it gets rolling, it will happen, the melting will happen faster than we have anticipated till now. And it's on an exponential curve, and therefore we should anticipate 3 to 10 feet. Now, if that's true, I was thinking about that here in the San Diego area. We have a lot of coastline. And even a 3-foot sea level rise would be just diabolical for us. Specifically about sea level rise, is that something that, is Englander on course, do you think, or are we, is he too pessimistic?
No, that's absolutely about right. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gives sea level rise at the end of this century as potentially as high as 3 feet, but also it says we cannot rule out a 6 feet rise in sea level, and this is related to how fast, how unstable the West Antarctic ice sheet is, and the Greenland ice sheet is. So this absolutely. We can expect very high sea level rises. Also, the key thing with tipping points, I should emphasize, is the one thing with a tipping point is the abrupt change. Something changes abruptly, but another point is irreversibility. In this paper I was talking about, they particularly emphasize this irreversibility, that even once the process goes past a tipping point, even if you stabilize temperatures, you're still going to have this irreversibility. It's going to keep on sliding into the sea until it runs out of steam. So that's and so that locks in sea level rise as constant adaptation for centuries, for thousands of years. And we may be able to adjust the rate of change if we reduce emissions really rapidly, but we won't be able to change the ultimate destination. That's the key point with the tipping point. Same with the Amazon, same with the Atlantic overturning circulation. They'll just keep on changing states until they arrive at a new state. And that's a profound responsibility for this generation, not least because, we can say with a very high degree of confidence that for the last 10,000 years, which we call the Holocene, it has been a remarkably stable state for humanity. It's been, the Garden of Eden type of state. It's been absolutely perfect for developing a civilization. In fact, we know for certain that civilization can develop, can thrive in a stable Earth system, a stable climate. But we don't know how well it can thrive on a destabilizing planet, which is what we're now at risk of. The planet is destabilizing right now. It's a case of how much and how much we can pull back. And that's the key thing with the planetary boundaries framework. If I move on to that for a few minutes. So
Owen, before you move on, could we just go back a little bit on tipping points? One question was that article that you said you just came out with, where was that published again? You mentioned it, I didn't catch it.
It's in the journal Science.
Okay, Science. Okay, great.
Which is one of the world's leading academic journals.
Yes, great. My other question was, have you looked at biological tipping points such as mass extinctions?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and in fact, with the planetary boundaries work, we do look at biodiversity and in particular, tipping points around that. So yeah, and we have a big program of work at the Stockholm Resilience Centre on what we call regime shifts, when ecosystems change states, and we can see this with eutrophication, for example, with runoff from fertilizers can cause create over too many nutrients in an area. That ends up causing dead zones, and the ecosystem tips into a new state, a state with very little biodiversity.
What's your timing on the mass extinction? Do you have any estimates?
Oh, well, we're already in a mass extinction event. I mean, we're already losing species at mass extinction rates. So if the timing is now, we have to curb the loss of biodiversity as soon as possible, because the issue is, it's not just we're losing species, we're taking away entire ecosystems. We're losing the whole lot.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful.
Okay, so as I was saying, so we have this 10,000-year period of grace. Civilization has emerged in this period, and we can see how civilization has been able to thrive in this period. So this was really the starting point for the work on planetary boundaries. If the Holocene is the ideal state for a civilization, then what are the boundary conditions that keep us in that state? So back in 2009, researchers led by Johan Rockström at the Resilience Centre, they analysed the conditions and proposed that there were 9 key systems or parameters that keep Earth in this Holocene-like state, which is really interesting. So it wasn't one, it could have, that as a conclusion, just climate or just biodiversity. And it wasn't 1,000 either. It was 9. So a kind of a manageable number. And these relate to the ozone, for example, our use of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, our water use, chemical pollution, aerosols, particles in the atmosphere, climate, biodiversity, and deforestation. So altogether, this package was assessed, and at the time in 2009, we concluded that 3 of the boundaries had actually been exceeded. We're beyond the Holocene state, and what we mean by beyond that state is that we're in a danger zone. So at risk of tipping points, so if we stay beyond that state, because the issue with tipping points is we don't always know exactly where they are. So even though we can see very, very profound changes in the West Antarctic ice sheet in Greenland or the Amazon right now, we can't say precisely where the tipping point is. So the boundaries was taking a precautionary approach to the Earth system. Where do we know is safe? And we concluded that we've gone beyond 3 boundaries. Then in 2015, we did an update of the boundaries work and concluded that we've gone past a 4th boundary related to land use, to deforestation. And then just this year, I mean, this is hot off the press, just as in January, February, we published a paper showing that we'd gone past the chemical pollution boundary. And that includes plastics, for example. We have 100,000 man-made chemicals in the environment, and we have very little understanding of their impact on the environment and how they interact. So we're in a very dangerous situation with chemical pollution. And then in May, we published a paper on the water boundary, and then concluding for the first time that water has been exceeded, particularly what we call green water, soil moisture. We've exceeded a boundary on there. So all to say, we have 9 boundaries identified. Now we have 6 boundaries have been transgressed. We've crossed them. We're in the danger zone of potentially crossing tipping points in these states. And this is, and obviously we're seeing the impacts of this right now. We're seeing more chaotic weather. We're seeing, a rise of zoonotic diseases. We're seeing, seeing more and more extremes. And we're seeing this knock-on effect on societies as well. There are clear risks to societies from this. So that's to conclude the planetary boundaries work and the tipping points work. So I'll maybe open up for questions there.
I had a comment that some researchers in Washington State found a large quantity of deaths of coho salmon, and what they eventually have now decided is that the cause is, as we drive, our tires emit microparticles of the composites that's in the tires, and that one of the components is something called 6-PDD or some such thing. We're not even sure what's all in it. It's at least 40 different compounds. And the 6-PPD is toxic to the coho salmon. And then they observed that the average car emits or spins off 10 pounds of these particles every year, normal driving, and that EVs, because of the heavier weight batteries, spin off 12 pounds of these toxic plastic and compounds, whatever all's in them. Apparently different tires have different compositions. So it's just a small example of the kind of mess that we're making. How do we deal with all of the stuff coming off of our tires as we drive, and even makes EVs more worrying because they spin off more of this polluting chemicals and the like. So it seems to me that what you're saying, the conclusion that we've exceeded the boundary around man-made compounds must be right.
Well, yeah, and I should then emphasize then that the conclusion on man-made chemicals is based on exactly what you're saying. It's the fact that we're producing these chemicals at scale. We don't understand how they interact with the environment, and we don't have the legal system, the governance system in place to be able to react in enough time to give enough warnings and to provide enough information on the dangers before it happens. New solutions are just rolled out with new chemicals that we seem harmless, but then you don't see the whole Anthropocene effect, this emergent effect we have because we're operating at a global scale. That if there was only a few hundred cars on the road, it wouldn't matter so much. But given the hundreds of millions, then this all adds up. So yes, you're right to point this out. It's also has a health impact as well. The particles from tires can get into people's lungs, so it's a big problem for cities, particularly in winter with winter tires, is my understanding of it. So these need, and there are solutions to this. Absolutely, they're both technical, practical solutions, but also systemic solutions on better transport systems that reduce the need for as many cars on the road.
Another question. In your book and movie, you have Ramanathan commenting on aerosols. And he's recently been making a lot of comments about climate change as an existential threat. Could you say what he means by that?
Yeah, so without doubt, there's been some really interesting papers on climate as a risk amplifier and an existential threat. So number one, if we look at it from across a few different scales, you know, when I was in New York last week for New York Climate Week, I was speaking at an event with several heads of state from small island states. And, you know, we've just been speaking about sea level rise of 30 foot potentially in the long term, but even, you know, 3 foot or 6 foot in the short term. That's existential for small island states. Absolutely. And then when we look at, you know, a huge proportion, billions of people live close to the sea. We have many of the world's mega cities with populations of greater than 10 million people close to the sea. You know, Bombay, you know, Calcutta, New York, San Diego, Los Angeles, London, Amsterdam, you name it. And these cities are going. They're facing their own existential crisis. They will have to adapt. They will have to put huge investments into adapting, and we'll have to make very big decisions. I mean, we won't be able to save all coastal towns and cities. It will just be too expensive. So the rich countries will be able to survive. You know, Dhaka and places, you know, Bangladesh and poorer countries. What are they going to do? So there's existential risks at that level, and then there's the risk amplifiers. You know, we're already seeing you know, pullback from democracy. We're seeing the rise of authoritarian leaders. We're seeing difficulty making long-term decisions, big collective decisions, and we're seeing a lot of fragile states. And a lot of the fragile states in the world are around the equator, in the Middle East, in North Africa, you know, Philippines, places like that. Pakistan, well, you know, Pakistan is a fragile state. 1/3 of Pakistan is currently underwater with thousands dead as a result of the phenomenal flooding there. So you can see that if we have fragile states in areas that are going to get warmer and hot, much hotter, and in fact, for many parts of the year, people will be living in conditions that we would consider today to be inhabitable. You know, we'll have cities with, you know, 10 million people in them, in sweating under those conditions. Then we can see that that's going to have a destabilizing effect on societies, and then that's going to have a knock-on effect on other places in the world who are going to have to deal with the conflicts erupting there. So in many ways we can see climate change at that global level as a risk amplifier when it comes to sort of you know, existential crises. When it actually comes to, you know, will climate change be have the potential to cause civilization to collapse? I would think that on its own, it probably doesn't, even though what we're talking about is very serious and is going to seriously affect many populations. I think on its own, we will be able to adapt, etc. But when we face these multiple crises, that will make it more difficult.
Thanks.
The 9 boundaries, and having exceeded 2/3 of them now, just is incredibly distressing. You know, it's the core question becomes, what do we do about that? How do we recover? How do we respond? And I think that's what your second book, or the most recent book, is all about. Would you like to pick up the conversation there?
That's right. So we published Earth for All in the first edition. Actually, is in German. Early September, which is now sold out 4 times. In fact, we're in the 4th reprint. It's a bestseller there. We are blown away by that. And then it came out in English on 20th of September, and it's doing very well, I believe. So, and basically the focus of Earth for All is, well, how can we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? How can we achieve well-being for all, given we're now 8 billion people, but 1 billion very wealthy, and then the rest of the world very poor? How do we, is it possible that we can all have a high standard of living and remain within planetary boundaries? So we put together this incredible modeling team and a transformational economics commission. So there's 2 intellectual engines for the Earth for All project. This modeling group doing system dynamics modeling with a new model called Earth 4, which we then called Earth for All because it's optimized for well-being instead of economic growth. And then we took a transformational economics commission. We had some of the world's leading economic thinkers, people like Kate Raworth and Tim Jackson and Coletta Perez and many others on this transformational economics commission. And then we created a feedback loop between the modeling team and the economics team. So the economics team could propose ideas and solutions, and the modeling team would look at, well, are these solutions really big enough to have a big enough change, a big enough impact over 8 billion people and growing over this century? And then we'd feed that back into the Transformation Economics Commission. And anyway, we started until we came up with results. And basically, we looked at 2 scenarios this century. Too little, too late was the first one. What if we keep on the trajectory we're on? We're sort of limping along. We're making some progress on the energy transition. The energy transition will happen. If we look at all policies in place, temperatures could stabilize between 2 and 3 degrees this century, and which would be disastrous for humanity, by the way. But if we take a giant leap, our second scenario, could we avoid that? Could we stabilize temperatures around 2 or below 2 and provide well-being for all? What would it mean? What would it cost? And our incredible conclusion is that it is possible. The window is still open to stabilize the planet, to remain within planetary boundaries or close to planetary boundaries, and to live on a relatively stable planet and have a very high well-being for all. So there was some good news there, but it would take to reach the giant leap scenario. We need a huge effort this decade. The heavy lifting has to start right now. So we need to build a huge coalition of the willing around that at the moment, and therein lies the problem, because we really don't have the scale of the coalition we need right now, sort of cross-party coalition to make it happen.
So what are the well, first of all, I was very struck. I just wanted to comment. Bhutan for some time has had the gross national happiness index, right? And it struck me that this is very much similar to the idea that you've come to in with the well-being index, which is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. So with the modeling work, what one of the novelties of our modeling work this century is to include a well-being index in the model, so we can chart well-being in 10 regions in the world, in the United States, in Europe, in South Asia, in Africa, and then we can also model social tensions. What's going to happen with social tensions in the world, and give a sort of general snapshot of things there. And we can see, and we can make some assumptions about social tensions, for example, and well-being. What clearly throughout the world, well-being is linked to things like inequality, government spending. Here in Sweden, there's a very high very high levels of equality, very high levels of well-being. That's linked to government spending, but also as we go through the century, linking it to carbon dioxide emissions, that once we reach these critical thresholds, 1.52 degrees, etc., it's going to affect people's well-being. You're going to be living in more intolerable conditions with more uncertainty. Economic security is also, linked to well-being. And also, food and energy prices. And we can see this in Europe now, the US to some extent as well, that we're getting food and energy volatility, and that's also linked to people's well-being and sense of security. So we've included these in the model, and we can see how that evolves this century. And I'm not saying that our conclusions are definitive. This is new areas of research putting these kind of things into models, but we can make some strong statements, I think, there. And just to say as well then on well-being, so Bhutan has its happiness index, but you also have a new alliance of countries coming together around well-being and thinking, how do we go beyond just a linear, it's just a focus on GDP. We're seeing New Zealand, Finland, Scotland, Wales, and Costa Rica and Canada are now talking about joining the Wellbeing Alliance. And these countries are, really, really progressive. There's been a lot of talk in the academic world about this for decades. Now we're seeing countries adopt it. And we can also look at the Nordic model as well, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, with very, very high standards of living over the last couple of generations, yet and are decoupling their economies from carbon very, very rapidly, and maintaining that high standard of living. So there are some good models out there to explore new approaches to well-being.
Thank you. We have in the book you describe 5 objectives, I guess, in creating Earth for All. And I think part of your linkage must be to identify these 5 paths as keeping us within boundaries or pulling us back from the boundaries we have exceeded. But I couldn't easily find the link, how does reducing poverty, which of the 9 boundaries does it address, kind of thing. If you've done a mapping on how these 5 activities relate to the boundaries?
Yes, we have done a mapping of that, and the modeling work links them all together neatly. I mean, so the obvious ones that link to the boundaries. I mean, our food system is the biggest driver of exceeding planetary boundaries. When we look at the scale of the food system and deforestation and other land use, this reaches the boundary on deforestation, the boundary on water use, the boundary on land use, the boundary on climate, the boundary on biodiversity. So the majority of boundaries are somehow impacted by our food consumption, and then obviously climate change and the energy system is one of the big elephants in the room and that's the big one for the climate boundary. But your question on how the other boundaries are linked to it, I mean, we can, this food and poverty are obviously very closely linked, and energy and poverty are very, very closely linked. But one of the key things we argue in the book is that we need to be able to make progress because the scale of the change is so huge. We need such big political coordination and cooperation across traditional political divides to be able to make progress here, almost like that sort of wartime levels of mobilization. And that means everybody has to feel that we're all in it together. And we know that greater equality in the world, both between nations and within nations, can improve social cohesion. And we need that social cohesion to make progress. So there's extremely strong reasons why inequality will help drive social cohesion. It's not the be all and end all. It's not a silver bullet, but greater equality will help drive social cohesion. And in terms of poverty, we need the poor people need to come out of poverty, and they need huge support to do that. Otherwise, the risk is that the route out of poverty will be the tried and tested, destructive, fossil-fueled route out of poverty, which is not going to help solve the problem. It's going to make the problem much, much worse. And then on gender, many of the, from an ethical dimension and humanity, the progress of humanity dimension, gender equity is very, very important. But what we find is that when women have more economic opportunities, girls have better education, then we address population, and we look at in our model. We see very rapid economic development in poor countries, the poorest of countries today, and that helps stabilize populations at below 9 billion. Even within our too little too late scenario, population stabilizes at around 9 billion and then starts falling, so 1 billion more than today. And in a giant leap scenario, the positive scenario, we stabilize population something around 8.5 billion, so 500 million more than today. And that's lower than the mid-range UN estimates, and that's down to our drive for sort of more rapid economic growth in those poor countries. So it's assuming countries like Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo sign a development bargain between the elite and the population to grow their economies. So that's it. So that's the whole systems view, and how each of the 5 turnarounds are linked to the boundaries.
Excellent, thank you. Project Drawdown, by the way, has similar views on empowering women, right? And making that a very, very powerful, a very important component. One of the
I would say as well that in the Wellbeing Alliance countries I mentioned earlier, they're all run by women. That's probably not a coincidence.
No, good point. There is one of the very impressive arguments that you make in the book is that the top 10% of wealth holders in a society should collectively have no more than 40% of the wealth. Now that is obviously a major challenge to certainly the US approach to capitalism at the moment, right? Because we have a few extraordinarily wealthy people that far exceed the 40% limit. And I think that's probably true in lots of countries, actually, where people in power, corruptly or otherwise, accumulate a great deal of wealth to themselves. How do we approach that on a societal basis, and how does that, is there a linkage somewhere to, I guess I don't see it, between to that wealth stuff and climate and all, and how do we address this? We basically have to, you're saying, I think we have to modify our approach to markets and capitalism in order to be sustainable.
Well, yeah. Well, so you say, corrupt or otherwise. I mean, it seems in most cases it's not corrupt. It's just it's how this people are that wealthy because we've created a system that drives wealth creation. And which is not necessarily a bad thing at all. But when it becomes it reaches extreme levels, then it becomes very, very problematic for societal cohesion. And the basic system we have, that's the GDP growth of an economy, which can link directly to people's income, is growing at a much smaller rate than the growth in wealth. So they're just constantly diverging. One on a sort of very a small slant, the other on this very steep exponential curve, so that you're seeing that even in a pandemic situation where everybody is suffering, except the billionaires who see their wealth increase, and now we're in a situation where possibly this decade we'll see the first trillionaire before we see an end to poverty. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals aiming to end poverty by 2030. There's no way that's going to happen. Yet we'll create a trillionaire, and there's huge problems with that when you see societies that where you have a huge gap between the elite and everybody else. There's distrust in the political system. It affects democracy. It weakens democracies. And how much money do people really need? After that first billion, and and not least the 1%, the sector, the area of society with the biggest growth in emissions is the richest 1%. And it's one of the biggest areas of growth is in SUVs. These tell us a lot about society and our priorities. When you live in very unequal societies and people have very little economic security, then you create a rat race to you never feel secure. Even millionaires don't feel secure. There's an article in the New York Times a few months ago about this couple who had a joint income of $1 million, and they were still struggling to make ends meet at the end of each month, living in Manhattan, and they saying that which seems completely crazy, but when you itemize their bills, you go, yeah, okay, then in this sort of rat race, that's where we end up. So it's something we argue we absolutely need to address. I've just come back from New York, and I've spent quite a bit of time in San Francisco, and it's like a gaping wound in the United States. It's so you have people with clearly a lot of homelessness, a lot of poverty, and clearly a lot of people with mental health problems, severe mental health problems, wandering the streets in these areas where there's billionaires also wandering in their towers and helicopters. So we know this we need to somehow address this to deal with some of the crises we have. So I think what's novel in our work is that we make some strong statements that that inequality, greater equality, dealing with inequality, will help create the conditions, the foundations to be able to deal with these problems. And in Scandinavia, it's a more equal country. It's not very equal here in these countries, but it's certainly more equal. And we can see that this does have an effect on social cohesion and the ability to make long-term decisions and work on climate change. And then, incidentally, even the rich people in Scandinavia have a higher quality of life. They have greater longevity and higher well-being than rich people in very unequal countries like South Africa, for example. So it's counterintuitive, but it's a bit more equality is better for everybody.
Yeah, I must say, I find myself utterly frustrated every time I see Blue Origin polluting the air with more fossil fuel emissions as they go off and do their 10-minute ride for millions of dollars. And it's just,
that's right. What could be a more visible sign of this pointlessness of it's a pissing competition at the at a level we've never seen before as a society.
Yeah, it's true. One other related thing I've noticed recently in Swedish elections, that more right-wing government is in sway, and certainly we have some concerns about Italy, and France looks like they've come close to a right-wing government, and we certainly have our problems with our last president and his crazy right-wing agenda and followers. It seems to me that what you're talking about in part in Earth for All is the system that we've got is has led to these political divisions, and that if we moved more toward equality and the reduction of poverty and so forth, that we would have more, what's the word, cohesion, and less divisiveness. Is that part of the message?
Yeah, it absolutely is. But even so, even with more equal societies here, we're still seeing a drive to the right. Their narrative seems to be very, very powerful and difficult to dissuade people, to turn people away. But what we can see, though, is to turn people away from that narrative. But what we can see, though, is where are the roots of this? And I see the roots in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism that has driven greater inequality in the world. There's been promises that we would get the trickle-down effect, that a rising tide will lift all boats, as Adam Smith would say. But we haven't seen that, and that's very obvious to people, that people still feel left behind with the neoliberal agenda and with the globalization agenda. That the political promises that this would make lives better hasn't turned out. People are stagnating. People are losing jobs. They're losing jobs to robots, and that's not helping people. So then we see this a rise in populist leaders offering very simplistic solutions to these problems. But we're also seeing a rise in people like in the US, people like Bernie Sanders and AOC, who are also speaking directly to the working classes, who offer, I think anyway, a more nuanced view and understand the complexity of the challenges, and might be offering solutions that would actually benefit the working class and the middle classes that have been hollowed out by neoliberalism. Because ultimately, Trump and the far right parties, Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc., their solutions are not benefiting the working classes. They're not improving people's lot in life. They're not reducing poverty. That's really obvious. They tend to be very selfish and self-centered, and in fact, they're as parasitical as or more so than the people they're they claim to hate. So there's yes, there's a lot of contradictions in the world. I would say it's not entirely. I think a big part of it is down to the neoliberal agenda. That basically we've had a financial crisis and a pandemic where we're all much richer than ever before, but we have absolutely no resilience to shocks. And people are very worried about that now because the shocks are going to keep coming, as we argue in the book. So with Earth for All, we try to provide some solutions that build that resilience to shocks. These 5 extraordinary turnarounds we talk about are about creating shock absorbers. They're not about creating a utopian society. They're about creating functional societies resilient to shocks.
Oh, that's
Joe, if you don't mind if I jump in here for just a quick one.
Go.
Going back to something that you said a little bit earlier, Owen, in regard to adaptation, and within the context of the 6 broken boundaries that we've already experienced and the modeling work and the well-being index and social tensions that you speak about in Earth for All, obviously adaptation is proportionate to which of the scenarios you illustrated we might be in the trajectory toward. Adaptation obviously would be less if things stay below 2 degrees and hover around 1.5, etc. Is the concept of deep adaptation being considered as articulated by folks like Jen Bendell and David Wallace Wells? We've had some provocative discussions here within the North County Climate Change Alliance over the concept of deep adaptation and the potential of it psychologically turning people off to the extent where it actually incapacitates folks from being able to deal psychologically with climate change. Could you speak on that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say deep adaptation is already happening. If you look at Bangladesh, which is very, very low-lying country with a very, very large population and prone to extreme flooding, the government is already spending 7% of government income each year on adaptation. An extremely poor country now that's only going to increase. That's we're today 1.2, 1.3 degrees of warming. That's only going to increase this century. So we're going to have these this is where the social justice comes into play, that countries who have not caused this problem are going to have to develop their economies to bring their populations out of poverty under the most harrowing extreme circumstances that the rich countries have never, ever had to deal with, have been lucky enough to avoid, or through colonization have just extracted riches so they could grow more rapidly. So this justice issue is very, very real. Pakistan is calling for more investment to deal with the fact that 1/3 of the country is underwater, and it hasn't caused these problems. So but elsewhere, we're seeing in the research community bigger and bigger interventions to be able to adapt, and to be able to adapt on this centennial, millennial type of timescales. A paper was published a few years ago. Let's call it a thought experiment. It seems so far-fetched, but how could you protect Europe from the scale of sea level rise that's going to incrementally come decade after decade after decade after decade? Could we build a wall around Europe, from the UK to France, across the English Channel, and from Scotland to Norway? And the research paper looked at explored that what it would take to do it. It's fairly shallow seas. The distances are very large, but not impossibly large, or building seawalls around huge parts of around New York on a very large scale, for example. But then how big would they have to be to be able to, in the long term, think about the kind of sea level rises we need? So, but in some ways, adaptation is not even quite clear what the solutions would be. If you look at Miami, for example, that's built on limestone, so you can't even build walls around it. The water is just going to come up through the limestone. So you need other solutions. So we're an adaptable species. We can adapt, but it's gonna mean on a very big scale. Ultimately, large migrations away from the equator, moving up north to the northern latitudes and southern latitudes where the climate is going to be more livable. And we need to start thinking, that can be in a sort of chaotic process, or it can be done in a more managed way. But that's where we need to, that's how we need to start thinking about things.
Fantastic. Oh, and I personally just have one more question that I can think of right now, and it's in a way of punchline for me, and that is, given all the work you've done in these books and where we are, what would you suggest to us as individuals and to our modest-sized, North San Diego County alliance with our friends, mostly around the U.S. but scattered? What actions should we take, could we most meaningfully take, to move us in the direction of the recommendations in Earth for All?
Well, number one, I'm actually still optimistic that we can transform societies. Societies have transformed before, and they will again. But I think there's just two narratives at play right now. There's the Earth for All narrative of building resilient societies and on a resilient planet. And there's this, right-wing narrative at play, very insular, very nationalistic agendas that knee-jerk reactions to problems. So I think we're in an emergency situation. In fact, we published papers on this. I've created the Planetary Emergency Partnership as well, a big network of groups around focusing on it. We are in a planetary emergency. We do need to make very, very rapid change, and we need. And what's missing is the political will, a coalition of the willing at the scale required. It's as simple as that. We know what we need to do. We know how fast we need to move, and we're just not getting that. And I think at all levels, people should be out building coalitions around this agenda. We need the movement to keep growing, and that means being more politically active. Both in terms of civil disobedience, that works for some people and has been a very, very good tried and tested mechanism for driving change. And Extinction Rebellion are now using that for climate action, and scientists are joining as well, because it really is that serious. But from that level all the way through to developing citizens' assemblies, to lobbying politicians, and to making your voices heard, I'm absolutely convinced that it's in that political space that people need to find their comfort zone, where they're most comfortable. Not everyone's going to be comfortable gluing themselves to an oil pipeline, and that's fine. But anybody who supports democracy should be going out and using their voice in marches. And I'm particularly interested in citizens' assemblies as a mechanism to bring groups together who, from polarized viewpoints, that citizens' assemblies have helped depolarize issues in quite an interesting way. And they can work at from a town level to a state level to a country level. So I'd like to see citizens' assemblies on economic systems change, and maybe California could hold the first one.
What a thought. The Planetary Emergency Organization you mentioned is what's involved in joining, and should we consider that?
It's a very loose network of organizations that agree that we're in a planetary emergency situation, and we have like a 20-point plan on what governments need to do about it. And the framing, I suppose, is the international political agenda, what we need to see at UN, G7, and G20, and we're open to all. We hold sort of monthly, very lively calls on this, and we have Rainforest Alliance, we have academics, we have all sorts of groups.
Wow.
Yeah.
Would you send us a link for?
We'll do. We'll do. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Others, I guess I've still asked a lot of questions. Please go ahead.
You're doing great. I have a question I'd like to raise on the issue of basically education. A lot of people think that one of the strongest weapons we have is basically getting people where they understand how all this stuff impacts them. And I think that comes largely through education. So what you have is some incredible materials with your movie and your books. I'm interested in developing some short lectures based on those materials. Do you have, for example, the movie Breaking Boundaries? Is that available? I couldn't find it anywhere.
Well, it's available on Netflix, so it's you should be able to find it there. And I think for education uses, Netflix can provide a link to it. Is my understanding, and we still do showings of the film. You're right to point out education. At the Stockholm Resilience Centre, we consider, we've got the fast variables and slow variables when it comes to transformation, and education is a kind of slow variable. It's that shift in worldview over a generation or so, and we're failing. This is one of the biggest failings that virtually no university in the world teaches global sustainability as a sort of foundational module on every single course. Whether you're doing engineering, whether you're doing law, whether you're doing computer science, whether you're doing design, everyone should have global sustainability and the Anthropocene and planetary boundaries as the absolute foundation, because the economy needs to change, and the next generation in the workforce are going to be part of that change and drive that change. Yet they're coming out of these institutions without any knowledge of the scale of change that needs to happen. So that's one of the biggest failings we have, and we need to make progress there. Obviously, it's not just the higher education system; it's the entire education system. It's not producing kind of holistic systems thinkers who are cognizant of the scale of the planetary emergency.
One of my mentors from way back was Buckminster Fuller. And he loved to say that nature doesn't have a department of physics, doesn't have a department of chemistry, etc. And it occurred to me in thinking about breaking boundaries that one way of building a curriculum would be to have 9 courses on the 9 boundaries and their implications, really the Earth systems, right? It would be an entirely different way of organizing information, and we could, in each boundary, talk about chemistry, physics, et cetera, right? There's a great. It's not that those topics aren't relevant, but they would be more relevant in the context of looking at planetary systems.
That's a brilliant idea. Brilliant idea. I mean, we at the Resilience Centre, we do executive leadership courses, master's courses. We're doing undergraduate courses for science students and business students. We work with the Stockholm School of Economics on the business side of things, and so we're bringing the boundaries concept there. In fact, one of our issues is often that we have with too much demand and not enough time and resources to develop what we need to develop. But we need to make, and it shouldn't just be us. I mean, it's like, you know, we need to find some sort of global alliance that even if kids can't aren't taught by their universities these or schools, then they have access to it and they can teach themselves. Because, you know, this is what Greta Thunberg and others have done. A lot of kids in the climate movement are doing. So, but yeah, I love the idea of actually, yeah, instead of maths, physics, chemistry, then you teach the boundaries and you gain your knowledge of those foundations through that. That's brilliant.
Along those lines, Al Gore has a mechanism for basically trying to educate. He makes a set of slides available to people that have received some training from him. Do you have any slides available for your materials?
Yes, I do. I can send some slides on, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. So I'll be in contact with you.
Thank you so much for that, Owen.
Well, I
You're
think
welcome.
I'm going to interject here. And as we've been watching this, I could see it's getting darker and darker, Owen, where you are. I think the sun is setting. And so unless there's any other questions, I think we should sum up this excellent conversation. And thank you so much for participating and educating us. And I know that our members are going to really be thrilled to be getting a copy of this. And we have a tradition here at the North County Climate Change Alliance of presenting something special for our speakers because they're so gracious about sharing their time. And Meryl, did you want to do a screen share? So Owen, what we have done is we have purchased a tree in your honor here in California that is going to be planted in an area that has been burned out by wildfires. And so we just wanted you to know that this tree you can look it up online and see exactly what it's doing. And again, thank you so much for your work.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Indeed. Oh, and please send us your physical address and we will, or that we can mail the plaque to you about your tree.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, absolutely. Will do.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Owen, is it possible for any of us to contact you directly via email, maybe? I mean, I'm
Yes.
sure you're inundated by huge amounts of email like all the rest of us. Is that even possible that we could get through to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my Joe has my email address, so please do share it. And yeah, happy to continue the conversation via email. I better.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. And Owen, we want to wish you the best of luck and results in your new job. And,
Yes.
Thank you.
And please keep doing what you've been doing. What you're doing is important to the planet. We
Cool.
really appreciate it.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Likewise.